yeah, as Sophie said, I'm Heather. I work here as a postdoc on the Foundations of Animal Sentience project with Jonathan Birch and Eva, who's here, and Andrew as well, who's off doing the science part of it. And so within that, my role is looking at particularly questions about animal welfare and animal sentience. And so in general, my research program is very much about how we conceptualize and how we measure animal welfare. And so today, the talk I'm going to be presenting is just one part of that, one application of what I do on assessing measures of animal welfare. All right, so I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about what the roles are for the measurement of welfare and how we use these measurements. And then I'm going to present a framework for how we might assess the different measures that we have, and then look at some of the specific measures that are sort of on offer at the moment and look at how well they meet the requirements of these frameworks to figure out what the best ways are of filling in our needs. So when we measure animal welfare, there are all kinds of decision contexts where we need to know something about what the welfare of animals is like. And usually we need some sort of accurate measurement. Quite often we need this sort of quantified animal welfare so that we can input it into all these different kinds of calculations. And this includes a lot of public policy, so social welfare functions when they include animal welfare, which is rare, impact assessments, cost-benefit calculations. All these things, if we're doing them with animals in mind, are going to require these inputs that have animal utility. And like I said, it's pretty rare in animals. A few examples that I've seen where they've started doing this explicitly, sort of economists and people working in public policy, has been climate change policy, looking at some of the impacts on animals, different climate change events and different sort of policy recommendations, and also trying to sort of quantify the negative externalities of agriculture in terms of building into the costs, some of these animal welfare costs that the animals themselves are experiencing. Also, the context that I came into this in the beginning, this whole paper sort of came out of, is when we're thinking about prioritizing charitable giving or intervention. And so in particular, this comes in the effective altruism movement. So here, effective altruism is looking at, how to do the most good with any particular limited set of resources. And when we're thinking about that in terms of animal welfare, we're trying to compare different interventions or different investments in terms of how much animal welfare benefit we actually gain. And so a lot of these different EA groups use something like the suffering calculators that I've put up here. And they input a whole bunch of different information. So things like the lifespans of different animals, the production amount of these animals over their lifetime, sentience multiplier, which is an extremely complex thing that I won't talk about today, but is another part of my work, figuring out how we compare the different sentience of these animals. The number of days of life that are equivalent to the pain of death, so the kind of the badness of the death of these animals. And the thing that I'm interested, which is this one here, which is the suffering per day of life. And so this is kind of the animal welfare measure itself. This is their quality of life measure that we're trying to figure out. What is it? How much suffering did these animals undergo? Or what is their welfare like overall? And then these numbers are used, as you can see here, to compare a whole bunch of different kinds of problems, most often different kinds of agriculture. So here we're looking at, should we invest in helping dairy cows or pigs or farm salmon? And then you can look at here what the relative suffering is, sort of these weighted days of suffering per kilogram of production. And so you can see on this table here that the farmed catfish come out as a very, very high priority, given the inputs to here. But what should be obvious is that the way that we fill in these columns is going to make a huge difference to the decisions that we make. And so I'm interested in how we fill in this kind of suffering per day of life question. And when I looked into it, what was really obvious is that typically right now what's being done is just a really subjective measurement. And for the most part, just estimates done by people, some of whom are experts, some of whom are just reading some of the literature, and just forming some kind of guess about what they think the lives of these animals are like relative to one another. And so this table here just has a range of these different estimates for these different kinds of production systems. And you can see that there's a huge amount of variation. So there's all kinds of estimates. These don't all correlate directly to each other because they're not all estimates on the same scale, but it still gives you this idea of how much variation you can see. And so to take one example for turkeys, these range from some positive estimates through to some very negative estimates. So not only can we not agree on how good or bad these animals' lives are, we can't even agree on whether they are overall positive or negative. So it seems like these kind of subjective guesses where people sit down and they, read about the lives of the animals and try and estimate how bad it is, isn't really a good way of doing this at all. And so what I want to do is, I guess, draw on animal welfare science to try and figure out some ways that we can fill these things in a little bit better. So what we really need is we need more principled ways of filling in these values. We need to figure out, there's more scientific ways of deciding what it is or measuring how good or bad the welfare of an animal is under different conditions. And like I said, I think animal welfare science is doing this, and what we need to be doing is kind of bringing these together and making sure that the best methods that are available within animal welfare science are being used as they should. And so in terms of thinking about them, there are a huge range of ways in which welfare scientists measure welfare, some of which are better or worse for these kinds of purposes. And so when I was thinking about it, what I've done is construct a sort of a framework for assessing these different measures against each other and figuring out how well they do for these purposes that we want. And in particular, sort of grouped these criteria, these desiderata, under 3 headings, which is the correctness, the usefulness, and the feasibility. And I'll go through this in a bit more detail now. So to start with the correctness criteria, these are the ones that basically just assume that the number that goes into the box is one that actually represents correctly the welfare of the animal. So this is really the most important one. I'm not trying to say that all the different desiderata are all equally important. They're all, some of them are more pragmatic, as we'll see. So these ones here, I think, are the central ones, because without them, the numbers we have are going to be somewhat meaningless. And so there are lots of different ways in which we can think of how a number can be correct, and I'll go through some of these. So to start with, validity. So basically, for a measure to be valid, it has to measure the target that we're wanting it to measure. And in some cases, this may not actually be what we're doing. So to start with, we need to be clear on what the target is. You're never going to know whether a measure is valid unless you know what your target state is that you're actually trying to measure. For the purposes of this talk and in most of my work, I take the target when we're thinking about animal welfare to be a subjectively experienced welfare. So this is the positively and negatively valenced mental states that an animal experiences, its pleasures and sufferings. We can think of hungers and curiosity, frustration, boredom, social contact. And then you can kind of bring all these together to integrate them into a single welfare score. So this chart up here just shows a rough way that this can be done. You can see a whole bunch of positive and negative experiences here that occur above and below the line. And you can take something like the area under the curve to be the total of the positive or negative experience that this animal has. And I mean, however you end up calculating that, it is these subjective states of the animal that are what count, and they're what we're trying to measure here. And so when we're thinking about the validity of our measures, what we want to be sure is that what we're measuring is the subjective experience of animals and not some other thing. Next one is accuracy, and that means that the measures we get are going to be close to the real values. And often validity and accuracy are going to be closely related, but they don't necessarily have to be. So you can have valid measures that aren't very accurate. I guess think about, say, if you're measuring temperature, you might feel how warm or cold your skin feels. That can be a valid measure of temperature in that, it is actually a function of how cold it is outside that makes your skin warmer or cooler, but it's going to be highly inaccurate. You're not going to have much idea sort of to which level of degrees the temperature is actually looking at. And so you're looking at these kind of precision and also sensitivity to changes. So we want numbers that come out that are close to the actual values of what the animals are experiencing. And also when there are changes, so there might be small variations going up and down in welfare, that our numbers are sensitive to those as well. Now, holism, this kind of goes back to validity as well, but we're thinking here about something that represents the entire target state. And so this is particularly important when we're thinking about measures of welfare, because a lot of welfare measures only measure one very specific aspect of an animal's experience. So sometimes it'll be physical health without considering psychological experience. That's very, very common. And what we want to make sure is that we've got a measure that's encompassing this whole thing, because if you miss anything out, you're going to end up pretty vastly inaccurate. If you're only measuring physical health, you think an animal's doing well, but it's actually suffering from a lot of boredom, you're just going to get the wrong numbers there. And we also want here reliability. So you want your numbers to essentially come out the same when different observers are doing it. So looking at different observers looking, the same observer looking more than once, or doing the same test, doing more tests. These are all different kinds of reliability. And you basically want it to be the case that the numbers that come out when you repeat these tests are roughly the same. And again, this is just a good guide to assuming that we've got sort of these valid and accurate measures. So the next set of desiderata that we look at are the usefulness criteria. And so these are a bit less important, but they're sort of more pragmatic concerns about getting the right kinds of outputs that will work in our tables, and particularly that we can do the kind of calculations that we need to do with. So the first one is the range of applicability. So it's not going to be very useful for us if we get measures that we can only use in one really specific situation. So some measures are specific to particular species or specific to particular contexts, but they're not going to help us make comparisons over different kinds of animals. So, you know, we've got here, say, crickets being farmed in an insect farm, horses being used for horse racing, salmon being farmed in fish farms, all these sorts of things we might need to compare against one another if we're trying to make decisions about, you know, which ones we use to intervene on, what the overall welfare impacts of different activities are going to be. And so we want to make sure that the kinds of measures we use are going to be able to be applicable across all this range so that we can do the things we need to do with them. And the other thing we need is cardinality. So, you know, many of the applications I was talking about at the start, we're going to need numbers that come out that are actually quantitative measures, typically ratio scale measures, because a lot of the scales that we use are going to need to use these kinds of operations. I've got other work that defends the idea that subjective welfare is something that we can measure on a ratio scale. I think it is if we use the right kinds of measures, but we're going to need to make sure that the measures we use are ones that do that. And in particular, we want to make sure we're not using ordinal measures that just rank some states of welfare as better or worse than others. We need to know by how much they're better or worse so that we can make these kind of quantitative comparisons between them. And the other thing about this is that we need it to be bidirectional. So we need it to include both positive and negative welfare states. And again, I add this just because there are a lot of measures that focus particularly mostly on suffering. So some of these measures we're looking at the start, these subjective estimates that people do, a lot of those were just based from a zero line downwards, and there was no, the scale itself didn't even include the option to go up into the positive. It was considered that the best possible welfare was neutral and everything got worse from there. And that's not going to give you an accurate view of what the welfare of animals is like. If you're not able to calculate when animals are actually happy, you're not going to be able to get what you need out of this either. And finally, we've got this sort of most pragmatic of the desiderata, which are the feasibility issues. And these may be less important than the others, but they're still going to make a difference in terms of what we choose when we're actually doing this on the ground, when we're getting out and doing research in all these different contexts. We're going to need things that we can actually use. So the first of this, let's see, there we go, ease of use. So that's just how easy it is to actually get out there in the world to collect and apply our different measures, because we've got different levels of invasiveness, we've got different levels of time investment, money, and all these things have real world limitations. We don't have infinite time. Some of the welfare frameworks that are used for assessing different agricultural settings have very strong time limitations on them, that you've got to sort of be in and out of a single farm within a certain number of hours. And so we need measures that are going to work there. We need ones that don't necessarily have really expensive equipment involved. If you're going to have to, you know, do big anesthesias every time you measure an animal's welfare, you're not going to be able to collect a whole lot of data. So we want things that are practical to use in the real world in this way. And then finally, data availability. And so this is something that is important for decisions we want to make now, not so much if we're looking at measuring into the future, but this is just how much current data exists for the species or the context of interest. So for a lot of things, and again, you know, I was thinking about this in this kind of EA sort of context, a lot of the times when they're trying to make recommendations, what they're doing is literature surveys of the work that's already out there. They're not actually setting out and going and measuring things themselves. And so the availability of a range of data about, you know, the experience of different species under different conditions using the indicators and measures that we want is quite important for these sorts of things. Obviously, it's something that in the future we can identify gaps in the data and go out to collect them. And then that relates back to this ease of use, how easy it is to fill in. But for more immediate applications, we do want the data to exist right now. So I've sort of presented here a rough framework of how we can think about assessing the measures that we have for animal welfare and the different ways in which they're going to be useful to us. And then what we can do is we can take the measures that exist and run them through this framework and have a look at how well they meet these different desiderata. And this assessment here is going to be a qualitative one, not a quantitative one. I've seen some people try to do quantitative ones where they assign each measure a score of how well it meets each desiderata. And you run into real problems there, figuring out, what is the meaningful difference between a 3 or a 4 or feasibility, and what are the weightings, what's the weighting of being a valid measure versus being easy to use. And I don't think there are good principled ways of setting these. I think you run into the dangers there of ending up sort of over-precisifying where that precision doesn't really exist. And so what I'm doing here is just a qualitative assessment, which is more of, I guess, a discussion of some of these methods where we look at them, we look at their pros and cons, we can sort of say, they fit these fairly well or not that well. And based on that, we can assess which ones are likely to be best for purpose. But certainly, what I present next, where I'm looking at these different measures and how we use them, isn't supposed to be a definitive ranking, all and forever. Measures are being developed all the time. Many of the ones I discuss are still fairly new. At the end, I'll discuss some very new ones that could be promising for the future. So, when you've got a framework like this, I guess it's something that you can update fairly frequently, because you can look at these new measures, or you can look at the existing measures and then new applications and make decisions about how good you still think they are. So the types of measures I'll be discussing now are grouped into 2 different types. So there are whole animal measures, and these are sort of single measures or indicators that take an output from the animal that represents its entire state of welfare at one time. And there are combination measures where we take a number of different indicators that measure different aspects of an animal's welfare and then combine them into a total score. So the whole animal measures, like I said, it's a single integrated output that measures the welfare of the animal. It tells you its entire welfare. And the benefits to this are obviously that you do have this single total score. You know that it's going to be holistic. And most of these methods are quite quick and easy to apply. As we'll see, I'll give some examples of them. The drawbacks to them is that you don't get any information about which specific parts of an animal's life are actually contributing to its good or poor welfare. So you can use a method, you can look at an animal and say, yeah, it's got 50% of its maximum welfare, or whatever your scaling system is going to tell you, but you have no idea how to improve it because you don't know specifically what in its environment is changing that. And that's something that also in the combination measures have a benefit of giving that information. So the first of the whole animal measures is the one that we covered at the start, which are these human intuitive estimates. So it's basically people sit down, they read a lot of information about the lives of these animals, everything that a broiler chicken undergoes throughout its lifetime, for instance, and then they make an estimate of how bad they think that life is relative to some minimum or maximum standard. Obviously, like I said, the problem with this is it's highly subjective. There seems to be low correctness in general. It's unclear whether this is even a valid measure, whether the thing that people are thinking about when they think of how good or bad an animal's life is really the experience that's inside an animal, or it's just someone's impression of it. It's certainly not accurate, as we saw, not reliable. These numbers are all over the place. It does have the advantage of being quite useful and feasible. So these measures, they do give us numerical outputs. They are quick and easy to apply. But I think the problems that we have in terms of their correctness mean that most of the time, they're not going to be very good for us at all. There may be some exceptions to this. Some people are now using Delphi methods, where essentially you take expert groups, you get them to discuss and reach consensus on the types of measures they're using and on the inputs they want. And from that point of view, if you use these kinds of methods, you've got people who know a lot more about the animals, and you do allow them to discuss and reach this consensus, perhaps you'll get something closer to a more accurate measure. But I think unless you've got nothing else, this isn't going to be one of our best options at all. So one of the things I do think is much more promising is qualitative behavioural assessment. And so this is a method based on the direct observation of animals, where people basically watch an animal moving about within its environment, or watch videos, even look at photos of it, and gather sort of an overall sense of what they feel what that animal's welfare is like, based on the way it engages with its environment. And so they sort of say that the human themselves is acting as the measurement instrument here, and that you're integrating all this information that the animal is outputting through the way its body language, its posture, its activity, and figuring out, assigning it different scores based on this. And so often people will sort of describe the different kinds of behaviors, relaxed, curious, happy, and they'll score along these. So the pictures here are usually they're given these kind of lines, they can draw an X anywhere along it, and these are then later quantified by the researchers. The interesting thing about these methods is that assessments of them have found them to actually be really quite valid, quite correct, quite repeatable. So When you validate them against other indicators of welfare, they do very well. There's usually a large amount of inter-observer agreement on the scores that they give, reliability and sort of test-retest. And so for these reasons, it's what seems to be a fairly useful, feasible method. It's quite easy to apply. People tend to not need a whole lot of training to go in there and do this relatively well. And basically it means that you can have people observe animals for not very long, take these scores, output, a numerical estimate of the animal's welfare that actually does seem to track the welfare of these animals. Probably the major drawback is the low range of applicability. So at the moment, there's a worry that this has mainly only been done in large mammals, and that our sort of human ability to track or estimate the welfare of others may be something that doesn't apply very well outside of those animals that are like ourselves in some way. The Francois Wemmelsfelder, who developed the method, thinks that becoming familiar with different kinds of species will actually allow us to do this more. So this is something you might see with zookeepers who work a lot with reptiles or fish, who are able to very, very quickly know that there's something wrong with their animals just based on, it's kind of an intuition, but it's an educated intuition based on their experience and their knowledge of the animals. And so it's possible that we can develop this across a larger range of species, but at the moment it is a worry that that isn't going to be as accurate once we get away from the animals that we're very familiar with. So next measure is cognitive bias testing. So there are a range of different cognitive bias tests. The ones I'll be talking about here are cognitive judgment bias. And these are sort of based on the theory that the way that you feel affects the way that you think. And this is something that came first out of studies on human depression, where it's found that depressed humans have a pessimistic bias. And essentially, this has started to be tested in animals and showing pretty promising results. And so what you do in these tests is you take an animal and you train it to expect a reward under one stimulus and a punishment under another. So say if the light lights up in the left corner of the room, they get some food, and if it lights up in the right corner of the room, they get a puff of air in their face, which most animals don't like very much at all. And then what you do once they've trained to that condition is you bring them in, you give them an ambiguous stimulus, which is a light somewhere along the middle of the wall, not quite at left, not quite at the right, and you look at whether the animal responds as though it's about to receive the reward or as if it's about to receive the punishment. And basically its propensity to behave as if it's receiving the reward is optimism, and if it's behaving more like it's going to receive the punishment, that's a more pessimistic bias. And so you can measure this, you can quantify it, and you can, from that, determine whether an animal has higher or lower welfare. And this has been shown to correlate quite well with other measures of welfare, such that animals with poor welfare will have a more pessimistic bias, and animals with good conditions, good welfare, will have a more optimistic bias. And so this does seem to have a high correctness. Like I said, it's been validated against other measures. It seems to be quite reliable. It's highly useful. It does give us the right kinds of outputs. Problem with this is that there's a low feasibility, and this is because that animals need to be trained in advance. So it's not an easy thing to do. There are some conditions in which it's going to be very difficult to apply. So when we think about getting out to the wild, for instance, looking at wild animals, it's not easy to see how we can actually train them to perform these kinds of methods. And there is also a worry that the very training of the animals themselves influences the results, because there's a fairly well-established literature on the fact that training is itself rewarding for animals. So it's potentially some problems there. There are other kinds of cognitive bias tests like attention bias. So animals that are with negative welfare are more likely to pay attention for longer to a negative stimulus, like a picture of a predator. And so these sorts of things might be much easier to apply in sort of quick real world settings, but they're not as well developed yet. So that's still, I guess, in the question mark side of things. So looking at these sort of methods, I've just done a rough sort of tick and cross here against the different Desiderata that we have. Like I said, this isn't meant to be a scoring method in that I don't just count up the number of ticks. It's more, how well it meets each of these things, and some of them being more important than others. At the moment, cognitive bias is probably our best output here, mainly because of the limits on QBA of the different types of species. It may have very low range of applicability, but if we could develop that further, it could turn out to be much better. So this again just depends on the future research, and these methods are all fairly new as far as the science goes. and they're being developed and they're being used in wider ranges of applicability all the time. So now I'll move on to the combination measures. So these are measures where you take a bunch of different indicators measuring different aspects or different components of the welfare of the animal, and you bring them together into a final welfare score. This has the benefit of providing detailed information about what it is that's good or bad in the life of the animal, which if we're wanting to do interventions, if we want to make changes for animal management, this is going to be really important. They have drawbacks, and these can be quite strong depending on what the actual framework is. They may be incomplete. So this is only going to work if you have a full set of indicators. Your score is never going to be of any use if you've missed anything out of your list. And you also have to be able to set weightings once you've got all these different indicators of how you combine them to one another to get a total output score. And that can be difficult to do without knowing how all these things impact welfare relative to one another. So there are a number of different combination measures. They're all fairly similar to one another, but I'll go through them now. The first one, the 5 domains. This is very, very popular, particularly within zoo animal welfare. This is probably the primary framework that's used now for zoo animal welfare assessments. And what they do is they identify these 5 domains of welfare. So they're nutrition, environment, health, behaviour, and mental states. And this is set up such that the 5 domains aren't all equal to one another. The first 4, which you can see sort of boxed off here, refer to the life of the animal, and then the 5th one refers to its actual experience. And that's the one that's supposed to be central. That's the one that's supposed to be important, in the same way that I was talking before about subjective welfare. So the idea is that you take measures in each of the other 4 domains, and then you think about how they refer to the 5th domain of mental state. So if you're thinking about nutrition, for instance, and access to food, you're not just saying access to food is important for welfare, you're saying an animal that doesn't have enough food will be hungry. And so it's a measure of hunger, which is a negative affect. If you're thinking about temperature, you're thinking about thermal comfort, which is that mental state. And so everything comes back to a measure of these. And so for this reason, it takes a range of these indicators. It does refer them back to subjective experience. It seems like it is valid, potentially not very accurate or reliable, depending on whether you get the right sets of things here. Fairly feasible. It's been operationalized such that you can do it with a fairly good question and answer survey. The biggest issue is that this gives an ordinal output. So in each of these different domains, you get a score, and it doesn't really try to combine these in any way with meaningful weightings. And the scientists who developed this very explicitly didn't try to do that because they saw this problem of trying to apply weightings. How much does nutrition affect welfare versus health? And so they just wanted to give a descriptive ordinal output that probably counts more like an assessment of welfare than a measure of welfare. So you're kind of figuring out roughly how good or bad an animal's life is and what it can improve, but you're not really getting this kind of output that we need. The next one, welfare quality. This is extremely popular in assessments of agricultural settings, especially within Europe. And essentially, it has this kind of same idea. So here's an example of a welfare quality system up here, that they've grouped these 4 principles of welfare, which is hunger, so I think it's nutrition and environment and health and behaviour, the same as what we see in the 5 domains. But here they do more explicitly try to quantify this. And so within each of these, they take a number of specific scores that relate to them. And you can see here the way they sort of move through. So you've got the principle, then you've got the criteria broken down from that, break those down into indicators. They then measure all these indicators, give them scores, and sort of put them through various weighting calculations until you get an output. The problem with this is that those weighting procedures are extremely opaque. They were based mostly on discussion from sort of experts and consumers, where they were set as weightings. And what that means is that we have no really good reason to think that they're representing the combined experience of an animal. So even if it is the case that they're managing to cover the full range of affects of an animal, the weightings that they're applying are very unlikely to be correct in this way. It is a useful and feasible method, though. It is something that's relatively easy to apply. It's been developed for a range of species. It's something that's not difficult to develop in terms of new species either. Even if you have individual differences between species, you can select different indicators as inputs, but still compare the outputs for each one. Like I said, the big problem here is figuring out the aggregations. And that's one of the reasons that these welfare decision support systems, which is the last type of combination method that I'll talk about, is better from that point of view. Again, it takes these sort of different needs of animals, breaks them down. For each need, it takes attributes, which are the different sort of indicators, like body condition score is an attribute related to hunger. But here they do make a principled attempt to try and get the weightings in a way that might actually reflect welfare. So they take these from different parts of the literature. They look at work on preferences in animals, at intuitive sort of, I guess, comments by scientists. And these weightings, I guess, because they are taken from different parts of the literature and they're taken from all different kinds of studies, they're not actually sort of researched in themselves. They're of varying quality. So this is something that the developers admit, that they're taking what they can based on what people have said, but they're not trying to say they're definitive. What's really good about this system is that it's very transparent. So essentially the table that's put together with all these different indicators and their weightings is adaptable anytime new information comes to light. So as it is, it's this kind of evolving system where we can input everything we know about welfare and the weightings of different welfare components as best we can right now, and then figure out, as we improve these things, get better and better scores that come out of it. So at the moment, it's probably sort of got moderate correctness. I think there's a good chance that there's going to be some aspects of welfare missing from the overall survey. The weightings are unlikely to be entirely correct. And moderate usefulness and feasibility for the same reason that, you know, we can go out, we can measure a lot of things. It depends what specific indicators you choose as your inputs. But because this is a transparent and a flexible framework, it means that it is something that's really useful because we can go back and we can improve it as our welfare science improves, and it is all the time. So animal welfare science is a fairly new discipline. It really only started sort of 30, 40 years ago. And so there's still a lot of development. We're still learning a lot about how to do all these things. And that means that we should have improvements in these kinds of inputs as well. So looking at the combination methods for that reason, again, like I said, this is more of a qualitative assessment. It's not supposed to be whoever gets the most ticks wins, but this decision support system here, I think, is going to be the most promising one for this flexibility. So, you know, put lines in some of the boxes just because we don't really know about their validity, their accuracy. It's very hard to compare these things at times, but at least we do get a sense that in the future it could be improved. And then to finish up, I'm just going to go through a couple of the measures that I think are potentially promising for the future. So one of these, neuroimaging, and this is looking at activation of brain regions that are associated with particular types of affect, clear amounts of pleasure and suffering. This is something that's been done in humans and appears to be valid in the cases where it's been used. So one experiment in humans cross-validated against different kinds of data. They got people put their hands in very, very cold water, which is painful when you put your hand in freezing cold water. And they took a brain reading. They looked at how many seconds the person was able to leave their hands in the water before they took it out. So they were instructed to remove it once it became too painful for them. And then they got the people to give a subjective report on how painful they felt that experience to be. And all these three measures correlated very well, which means that the behavior, the subjective experience, and the brain activity of the people all seem to work in conjunction with one another. So at least the pain experience, it does seem to be a valid measure. At least in theory, that would mean that we could collect information on a different range of welfare experiences. The sort of outputs it gives are the right kind for, you know, having positive and negative and quantitative that we can put into our calculations. There are going to be feasibility issues because these aren't easy things to collect, and it's not easy to take. I mean, it's not cheap or easy to get neuroimages of anyone, and particularly not of conscious subjects who can't volunteer for the procedure. So the very acts of restraint are themselves going to be stressful and can change a lot of your results. I know some people have now trained dogs to lie down in MRI machines and they can get information from them from those points of view. So there are some ways of doing this, but at the moment it may not work particularly well. Telomere length is another interesting one. So this is part of a group of measures that are called the biological markers of aging. And this is based on the background theory that exposure to all kinds of stresses, both physical and psychological, accelerate the rate at which you age. And so when you take an animal or a person and you look at their actual age in terms of, you know, how many years they've lived, and then you look at their biological age in terms of the damage to their cells or all these different sorts of things here, you can compare these things and look at how good or poor their welfare must have been in order to have accelerated the aging. And so telomeres are little bits of DNA at the ends of the chromosomes. And these, in anyone, will shorten over time with every time the cell divides. And they're responsible for a lot of the effects of aging. But animals that undergo stress will lose their telomeres quicker. And so relative telomere length can be used as a good assessment of kind of lifetime stress up until that point. And there does also seem to be some data, at least in humans, showing that sort of a healthy lifestyle and positive experiences slows that effect or even reverses it, so that it does actually go bidirectionality. But like I said, this needs to be established here. So at the moment, this is sort of a promising idea, but in terms of establishing whether this is actually a really good method, whether it captures all the things we need it to and not just physical stress, whether it captures positive experiences, is going to be really important. But if we could do that, they're going to be really useful methods because it's quite easy to get DNA from animals. I mean, a lot of animals, you can get them just from fecal or hair samples that they leave in the environment. So for wild animals, for instance, you don't even necessarily need to capture them. And so from that point of view, these could be really useful methods to get these assessments, but a lot more work is needed to establish whether they're actually going to give us the correct results. And similarly here, hippocampal volume, this works in the same kind of vein as what we were just discussing. The hippocampus is a part of the brain associated with emotional regulation, and the volume, the hippocampus, seems to be associated with the sort of cumulative experience of an animal. And so it's been tested and sort of trying to correlate the life of an animal, looking at how many negative or positive experiences it has, looking at the hippocampal volume. And at the moment, this is quite promising. It does seem to suggest that there is a correlation here. And so it's this same thing. It's this accumulation of lifetime welfare that's reflected in a part of the body. And so it does seem to be valid. Like I said, we need to confirm how accurate it is. Again, it could be missing things. There could be positive or negative experiences that I'm going to have that don't impact hippocampal volume. And there's a limited range of applicability, should be quite obvious. It's only going to be for the kinds of animals that actually have these brain structures, which is pretty much just vertebrates. So in terms of looking at crickets and things like that, this isn't going to help us at all. All right, so to finish up, there's a bunch of contexts where we need accurate measures of animal welfare. We need to put in input numbers that represent the welfare or the utility of animals so that we can make all kinds of political, social, moral management decisions. And my recommendation here, I've obviously gone through a number of the different measures that we can use and assess them according to their usefulness for this particular purpose. And I've discussed these kind of whole animal and combination measures. And what we're going to need is, I think, to use them in conjunction with one another. So we discussed the strengths and weaknesses of each type of measure. A whole animal measure is great because you haven't missed anything. It's giving you the entire integrated welfare output of the animal. It's doing so in a way that gives you the right kind of numbers to fill in what you need, but it lacks that information about the range of experience the animal has and what it is that's actually causing the positive and negative experiences in the life. And then you've got these combination measures, which give you a lot of information, but have these problems that they risk missing out parts of the experience, in which case they just give you completely wrong results. And setting the weightings within them so that we can determine which of the experiences are sort of more or less important in their impact on welfare, it's very, very difficult to see how to do this. But when we use them together, it means that not only can you use them to kind of cross-validate each other, so if you perform these two different types of measures and they give you similar results, you've got good reason to think you've got something that really does represent the welfare of your animal, you can use the whole animal measures to help you set weightings in the combination measures. And that's really important, I think, and that's something that we need to think about, that essentially if you can take an animal and take its whole animal measure, whether that's a QBA or a cognitive bias, and then perform an intervention on it that only interferes with one specific type, of impact. So whether it's altering its food or its access to housing, or whatever it is, and measure again, you can start getting a sense of how much that specific intervention changes the overall welfare of this animal. And the more often you do that, and the more different kinds of things you do that for, the better you're going to be able to establish how these different things are weighted within the mind of the animal themselves. So this is a really principled way of setting weightings, because we're figuring out, not how important we think they are, but how important they actually are in terms of impacting the animals. And so, again, this is something that takes time, but eventually, hopefully, we can use these things together like this to build a much better picture of what animal welfare is going to be like. And like I said, we use two together. The current best candidates are probably something like cognitive bias as our whole animal measure, and the decision support system models for the combination measures, because they allow for these flexible inputs. But it's not so important for my purposes here whether or not that actually turns out to be the case, whether one of these new measures I'm discussing turns out to be much better, whether I've mischaracterized one of the older measures such that it would be much more useful than we thought. What I really wanted to sort of emphasize here was the idea that we need to be figuring out our measures, we need to be assessing them according to how well they fit the purposes we have, and that requires identifying our purposes, as I did in the start, and figuring out what the desiderata are, and then looking at how well our different measures meet that. And once we do that, hopefully we get these better outputs about animal welfare that can then be used as inputs into all these various decisions as well. Thank you.